The station was nearly empty, dust devils dancing where the train had just been. Every cruel word she'd ever heard seemed to hang in that dusty air. Too big to marry, too plain to be chosen. They'd said it so often she'd started to believe it. And now, at 50 years old, standing on a splintered platform in the middle of nowhere, the truth of it felt as heavy as the battered suitcase in her hand. The stagecoach doors slammed shut, a final wooden punctuation mark on her rejection. She was alone. But that wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning. Because what the world dismissed, what her own family had mocked, someone else saw differently. From across the platform, a man leaned against a post. A cowboy with hands that looked like they were carved from old leather and eyes that held the quiet ache of too much loneliness. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't whispering. He was just watching her. And he didn't see a woman who was too big. He saw someone too rare to lose. In that single glance, everything was about to change. Most people missed it. They were too busy with their own lives, too caught up in the casual cruelty of their own judgments. They didn't see the immense strength it took for her to stand there, head held high, when every instinct told her to crumble. They didn't see the quiet dignity she wore like a threadbare shawl, or the way she refused to let the world's bitterness poison the kindness still living in her heart. But he noticed, and he didn't just notice. He pushed himself off that post and started walking toward her. That one simple act, a man walking toward a woman, should have been forgettable. But it wasn't. It was the first domino in a line that would stretch further and fall harder than either of them could ever imagine. Because love in the Wild West was never simple, and the secrets buried under this dusty town were darker than any night sky. What began with a single act of courage, a lone cowboy daring to claim what another had thrown away, would unravel years of pain. It would awaken a hope neither of them thought they'd feel again. But it would also awaken something else, something greedy and violent and determined to destroy them both. Stay with me until the very end, because hidden in this story is a secret that turned this man's life upside down, and a truth that proves sometimes the very thing the world calls worthless is the one thing worth dying for. The train had screeched to a halt, its iron wheels hissing like a captured beast. Dust and chatter filled the air, the sounds of a town too busy to notice the quiet heartbreak happening in its center. And there stood Clara. She clutched her worn carpet bag, the leather smooth from too many journeys that ended in disappointment. At 50, her face wasn't lined with the sharp edges of an easy life, but softened by one that had weathered too many storms. Her body, fuller than the other women in their corsets and bustles, had always been a target. Too big to marry, they'd whispered since she was 16. As if a woman's soul could be measured by the notch on a man's belt. She could hear them now, the ghosts of old voices and the fresh whispers of new ones. Young women in pretty bonnets giggling behind their hands. Men with hard faces shaking their heads, their eyes a mixture of pity and contempt. Their words didn't need to be spoken aloud. Their stares were loud enough. But Clara kept her chin steady. She'd learned to be a tree in a windstorm, not by ignoring the wind, but by growing roots so deep they couldn't be pulled out. Her life had been a long lesson in rejection, a forced marriage that ended in abandonment, a betrayal by her own blood. She'd been called a burden, a punishment, an embarrassment. And yet she remained gentle. She was the kind of woman who still baked bread for a neighbor who'd slighted her, who still prayed over the sick, who carried her dignity like a fragile lantern through an endless night. But standing on that platform, the lantern flickered. Loneliness was a physical weight pressing on her chest, heavy as the prairie sky before a storm. She'd come here on the promise of a new life, a marriage arranged by letter, a union not of love but of quiet necessity. But no one stepped forward to claim her. The minutes stretched into an hour. Her heart began to chant the same cruel words she'd heard for 40 years. No one wants you. You are too much, and never enough. Then, through the blur of her own shame, she saw him, the man leaning against the post at the edge of the station. Thomas. His hat was pulled low, shading his eyes, but his posture was different from the others. It was still, steady, utterly without judgment. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't turning away. He was just watching. And in his gaze she felt a strange shift. It was as if he wasn't seeing the size of her body, but the size of her story. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, something stirred in the pit of her sorrow. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was just a flicker, the faintest possibility, like the first star that dares to show itself before the dark has fully won. The platform slowly emptied. Families were reunited, strangers departed in wagons, their wheels kicking up the dust of new beginnings. Clara remained, her bag at her feet, a statue of quiet despair. The man who was supposed to meet her, a rancher named Jebediah Stone, whose letters were short and businesslike, never came. The promise of a new start was just another lie, vanishing with the last rumble of wagon wheels. She was alone. Again. The townsfolk's voices hung in the air, sharp as cactus spines. She looks like a punishment, not a wife. Who'd feed a woman like that on a poor ranch? The cruelty wasn't new, but each barb still found a fresh place to land. She pulled her shawl tighter, a flimsy shield against their glares. And then she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, the sound of boots that had walked too many hard miles to ever be in a rush. Thomas stopped right in front of her. Clara didn't dare look up. She braced herself for pity, for mockery, for the final twist of the knife. Instead, his voice came, low and calm. It was a gentle sound in a harsh world. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "looks like someone forgot to claim what's precious." Her breath hitched. Precious? The word felt like a language she'd never been taught. After a lifetime of being called everything but, it sounded impossible. She finally lifted her head and met his eyes. They weren't the sharp, assessing eyes of men who weighed a woman's worth like cattle at an auction. They were warm, lined by sun and sorrow, the eyes of a man who knew loneliness as an old, unwelcome friend. I think he changed his mind," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "Then he's a fool," Thomas replied, the words simple and clean. They settled over her like cool rain on parched earth. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't make false promises. He just stood there, as steady as the land itself, giving her room to breathe. The world had narrowed to this single moment. One man refusing to look away. She didn't know if this was a true kindness, or just another mirage that would disappear when she reached for it. But in his gaze she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Recognition. Not of her size, or her age, or her shame, but of her humanity. And that's when a new fear took root, a fear far worse than being abandoned. The fear of daring to hope again. Clara followed Thomas through the town's narrow streets. Her carpet-bag was clutched to her chest like a shield. He walked a few paces ahead, not offering his arm, not trying to take her bag. It was a different kind of courtesy, one built on respect, not obligation. Still, every step felt like she was walking on borrowed ground. Any second he would turn, his face changed, and send her away like all the rest. They passed shop fronts where women paused their sweeping to stare. Whispers trailed behind them like smoke from a dying fire. There goes. The widow Stone was supposed to marry. Imagine Thomas getting desperate enough to take her in. The words were sharp, but it was the looks that cut the deepest. That mix of pity and mockery that made Clara's stomach twist into a knot. Inside her head, the old voices grew louder, drowning out the sound of their footsteps. "No man will ever want you. You're too much to feed, too little to keep. Better you stay invisible." Her steps faltered. The world swayed for a second. Thomas noticed. He slowed his pace, turning just enough to meet her eyes. "You all right?" he asked. Clara nodded too quickly. "Yes, I just—" Her voice trailed off. What could she say? That her heart was a battlefield, torn between the desperate urge to believe in his kindness and the certainty that it was just another cruel joke. When they reached his wagon at the edge of town, he lifted her bag onto the back without a word. Then he turned to her. "It's a long ride to my ranch," he said, his voice soft. "I don't promise it'll be easy, but it'll be honest. That much I can give. Honest." The word hung in the air. Clara had lived her life in the shadows of half-truths and broken promises. A flicker of hope stirred, but doubt was a stronger, more familiar force. Why? Why would this man, this quiet, steady man, choose her, when the entire world had made it so clear she was unworthy of being chosen? As the wagon pulled out of town, the prairie stretched before them, a vast, golden ocean of silence. Clara sat rigid on the bench, her hands folded so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white. She wanted to ask him. She wanted to demand an answer. "What do you see in me that no one else ever has?" But fear was a gag in her mouth. So she asked the safer question. "Why were you at the station, Thomas?" He kept his eyes on the road, on the two horses, pulling them toward the horizon. "I make trips to town every few weeks, sell feed, pick up supplies, that's all. And yet you stopped for me." He was silent for a long moment. The only sound was the creak of the wagon wheels. "I reckon some things are too important to pass by," he answered simply. His words should have warmed her. Instead, they terrified her. Hope was a dangerous animal. It had turned on her before, left her with scars deeper than any blade could make. Her heart wrestled with itself. One side whispered, "Maybe this time is different." The other side screamed, "No kindness has ever lasted, and this one won't either." As the wagon rolled on, Clara looked out at the endless horizon. The sky was wide and unforgiving. The land was merciless. But for the first time in years she felt a choice lay before her, not a choice made for her by others, but her own. The choice between the prison of her past and the terrifying, uncertain freedom of a future she couldn't yet see. And she had no idea which one would destroy her. The prairie seemed to stretch on forever. The wagon rattled and creaked, a lonely sound in the vast emptiness. Clara sat stiffly on the bench, her eyes fixed on the line where the golden grass met the pale blue sky. Every jolt of the wagon sent her heart tumbling, a steady, uneven beat of hope and dread. Hope and dread. She tried not to look at Thomas, but his presence beside her was a solid, undeniable thing. His hands held the reins with an easy strength. But there was a gentleness in the way he guided the horses, a quiet click of his tongue, a soft word of encouragement. He didn't speak to her. The silence between them grew, thick as the afternoon heat. But Clara's mind was a thunderstorm. Why did he stop for me? How long until he sees his mistake? How long until I'm cast out again? She had lived with rejection for so long, it felt like a part of her own skin. Every time she had dared to hope, the world had slapped her down, laughing at her body, mocking her worth. The laughter of men, the cruel, dismissive eyes of women. Those were the scars no one else could see, and they ached more than any wound of the flesh. The horses slowed as the wagon began to climb a low, rolling hill. At the very top, the land opened up into a wide, sheltered valley. Clara drew in a sharp breath. Below them lay a homestead. It wasn't large or grand, but it stood proud against the endless sweep of the prairie. A modest ranch house, a sturdy, weathered barn, and fences that had been mended with care. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, as if the house itself were breathing. Alive. Waiting. "This is it," Thomas said, his voice quiet. "Home. Home." The word was a strange, painful twist in her chest. She hadn't called any place home in decades, not since she was a child, and even then, her father's house had been a place of duty and silence, not comfort. Could this place, a place she had never seen, be a home for her? The wagon rolled down into the yard. Chickens scattered, clucking in protest. A dusty brown dog barked once. Then, seeing its master, its tail began to thump against the ground. Thomas hopped down from the wagon. He turned and offered a hand to help her down. Clara froze. The ghost of 1,000 insults whispered in her ear. He'll feel how heavy you are. He'll drop you. He'll laugh. But Thomas didn't laugh. He just waited, his hand open, his posture as steady as a fence post, sunk deep in the earth. With a trembling hand, Clara placed her own into his. His grip was warm, firm, solid. He helped her down from the wagon, his eyes on her face, as if her dignity was a thing worth protecting. For a flicker of a moment, she felt something she had long forgotten. Respect. The house inside was plain but spotless. Worn wooden floors, curtains faded by the sun, a kitchen table scarred by years of meals and conversations. It wasn't a place of wealth. It was a place shaped by honest work, by careful hands. Thomas set her bag down by the door. "You can take the back room," he said. "Fresh linens are on the bed. It ain't much, but it's yours." Yours. Another word that felt like a splinter in her heart. She had belonged to no one and nothing for so long. To be told that even a small, simple room was hers, it was almost too much to bear. That night, she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her hands folded in her lap. The silence of the house pressed in on her. It wasn't a cruel silence, but it was heavy, unfamiliar. She could hear Thomas moving in the other room, the sound of his boots on the floorboards, the faint splash of water in a basin, the ordinary sounds of a man living his life. To Clara, they sounded like a foreign language. Her mind whispered its old, familiar warning. Don't trust this. Don't trust him. Nothing good ever lasts. But for the first time, her heart whispered something back, a soft, stubborn refusal. Perhaps this time is different. But then he said something that made the blood run cold in her veins. He was standing in the doorway, a silhouette against the lamplight from the other room. "Jebediah Stone," he said, his voice low. "The man who was supposed to meet you. He's my brother." The floor seemed to drop out from under her. This wasn't kindness, this was pity. Or worse, it was a duty, a family obligation. The hope that had just begun to flicker inside her was instantly extinguished, leaving behind a cold, bitter ash. She wasn't chosen. She was just a problem he had to solve. The air in the small room went thin. Clara stared at him, the man who had shown her the first real kindness in years, and all she could see was a lie. "Your brother," she managed to say, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. Thomas nodded, his face unreadable in the dim light. "My younger brother. He owns the ranch bordering mine to the south." 1,000 questions crashed through Clara's mind, but one rose above the rest. Why didn't he come? Thomas's jaw tightened. He looked away, out the small window into the dark. "Caleb, he's not like me. He's reckless, always chasing something new. A new scheme, a new card game, a new woman." He sighed, a heavy sound filled with a long history of disappointment. "He never should have sent for you, ma'am. It was a whim. He likely forgot you were even coming the day after he posted the letter." The humiliation was a hot wave that washed over her. She wasn't just rejected. She was forgotten. An afterthought. A whim. "So you came to the station for him?" she asked, her voice flat. "To clean up his mess?" "No," Thomas said, turning back to face her. And for the first time she saw a flicker of something sharp in his calm eyes. "I came for me. I read the letter you sent him, the one where you told him about your life, about your hopes for a new start." Clara felt her cheeks burn. She had poured her heart into that letter, a desperate plea for a life of simple decency, a life where she wasn't judged or mocked, and Caleb Stone had probably used it for kindling. He left it on the table at the saloon, Thomas continued, his voice laced with disgust, for all his friends to read and laugh at. The breath left Clara's body in a painful rush. She saw it all so clearly. A smoky room full of rough men, passing her letter around, their laughter echoing off the walls, laughing at her pain, at her hope. I took it from him, Thomas said, his voice dropping lower. And I decided then and there that a woman who could write with that much honesty, with that much grace after everything she'd been through, she deserved better than a man like my brother. She deserved to be met at that station with respect. His words were a balm and a poison at the same time. He hadn't pitied her. He had admired her. But it didn't change the fact that this was all built on his brother's cruelty. She was here because of a family drama she wanted no part of. "I can't stay here, Thomas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not your responsibility." "This ain't about responsibility," he said, taking a step into the room. "This is about what's right. Caleb owes you an apology, and I intend to see that he gives you one. You stay here, in this house. You're safe here. I give you my word." His word. What was the word of a stranger worth? Especially a stranger whose brother had treated her like garbage. And yet, she looked into his eyes, and she saw no deceit, only a deep, quiet resolve, a weariness as if he'd been fighting his brother's battles his whole life. She was so tired, tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of being alone. For one night, just one night, she wanted to believe that someone's word was enough. She gave a small, defeated nod. But as he left her alone in the quiet room, a new thought, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. If his own brother was this cruel, this careless with people's lives, what other secrets was this family hiding? And what would happen when Caleb Stone, the man who'd laughed at her soul, realized his brother had brought her home? The days that followed were a strange mix of peace and torment. Thomas was true to his word. He treated her not as a burden or a charity case, but as a guest, an equal. He worked his land from before the sun rose until after it set. He was a man who spoke the language of hard work better than he spoke English. And in his quiet presence, Clara began to feel a sliver of safety she hadn't felt in years. He never commented on her size. He never mocked the way her hands sometimes trembled when she tried to cook, her skills rusty after years of having no one to cook for. If he noticed her flinch when he came into a room too suddenly, he said nothing. He just gave her space. And in that space, something inside her that had been clenched tight for decades began to slowly, cautiously unwind. But the silence, while peaceful, could also be a breeding ground for fear. Every evening they would sit at the scarred kitchen table and eat their meal. The silence was companionable, but Clara's mind was screaming. She wanted to ask him about Caleb, about his family, about the secrets that she felt lingering in the corners of this quiet house. But the questions felt too dangerous. Instead, she asked safer things. "Do you always work this land alone?" she asked one evening, after they had spent the afternoon mending a long stretch of fence together. Thomas wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Been that way for a while now," he said, his eyes on his plate, "since my wife passed on." Clara's heart gave a small jolt. She hadn't even considered. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. He just nodded. "It was 10 years ago. Fever. There was nothing the doc could do." His eyes, when he finally looked up at her, held no plea for pity. Just a plain, simple truth. The house gets quiet. For the first time, Clara wondered if the loneliness that had hollowed her out had also carved its shape into him. That night, as she lay in the narrow bed, a new thought took root in her mind. A fragile, frightening thought. Maybe we are both broken in ways the world can't see. And maybe two broken things can fit together in a way whole things can't. But doubt never sleeps for long. A week after she arrived, Thomas announced he was riding into town for supplies. He suggested she come with him. Clara's stomach turned to ice. The memory of the station, of the whispers and the stares, was still a fresh wound. To show her face in that town beside Thomas felt like walking into a den of wolves. I think I'd rather stay here, she whispered, unable to meet his gaze. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. You have as much right to be in that town as anyone, Clara, he said gently. His words were kind, but they stung. A right? No, she thought. The world had made it clear her whole life that she had no rights. She didn't belong. As he drove the wagon away without her, Clara stood on the porch, her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles were white. She hated herself for her fear, hated the way her chest ached with a shame so old it felt like part of her bones. The war inside her raged louder than ever. Stay small, stay hidden. That's how you survive. But he sees you. He treats you as if you matter. It was too much hope, too much to bear. Clara sank into the old porch chair, her face in her hands, and for the first time since coming to this ranch, she wept. Not the quiet, desperate tears she had shed for most of her life, but great, wrenching sobs, the sound of a soul caught between its chains and the terrifying possibility of freedom. She was so lost in her grief that she didn't hear the sound of another horse approaching. She didn't hear the jingle of spurs or the soft thud of boots hitting the dirt. Not until a voice, smooth as whiskey but with a cold edge, cut through the afternoon quiet. Well, well, look what my brother dragged home. Clara's head snapped up. Leaning against the porch rail, a cruel smirk playing on his handsome face, was a man she had never seen before. But she knew with a sickening certainty exactly who he was. Caleb Stone. And the look in his eyes was not just mockery. It was the look of a predator that had just found its prey. Caleb Stone was handsome in a way Thomas was not. Where Thomas was weathered and steady, like an old oak tree, Caleb was sharp and restless, like a summer storm. His eyes were a brighter blue, his smile quicker, but there was a coldness underneath it all. He pushed himself off the railing and sauntered toward her, his eyes raking over her body with open contempt. I must admit, I'm surprised, he said, his voice dripping with false charm. When Thomas took your letter, I figured he was just going to burn it out of some misguided sense of chivalry. I never imagined he'd actually collect you. The word hung in the air. Collect you. Like she was a piece of unwanted luggage. Clara scrambled to her feet, wiping the tears from her face with the back of her hand. She would not let this man see her cry. Your brother is a good man, she said, her voice shaking but firm. Caleb laughed, a short, ugly sound. Oh, my brother is a saint. Saint Thomas, the martyr of the prairie, always cleaning up my messes, always doing the right thing. His eyes narrowed. But this isn't him being good, sweetheart. This is him sticking a knife in my back. I don't know what you're talking about, Clara said, pulling her shawl tighter around herself. Don't you? He sneered, taking another step closer. She could smell the whiskey on his breath. I was supposed to marry you, not because I wanted to, God no, but because our father's will stipulated it. Clara's mind reeled. A will. My father was an old-fashioned man, Caleb explained, circling her now like a coyote. He believed a man wasn't whole without a wife and a family. He left this ranch, this big, beautiful, profitable ranch, to Thomas. And my ranch, the smaller, rockier, barely making a profit ranch, to me. He stopped in front of her again, his face dark with resentment. But there was a clause. If I were to marry and settle down within a year of his death, our properties would be reassessed. The land would be divided equally. Your arrival was my ticket to getting what is rightfully mine. It all clicked into place with a sickening thud. The letters, the arrangement. It wasn't a whim. It was a business transaction. She was a pawn in a game between two brothers. But you didn't show up, Clara said, the pieces fitting together. I got a better offer, Caleb said with a shrug. A card game. I figured I could win enough money to hire a lawyer to break the will. And I figured well, I figured you'd just get back on the train and disappear. No one would miss you. The casual cruelty of it stole her breath. But my sainted brother, he spat, couldn't leave well enough alone. He brings you here, to his house. He shelters my bride-to-be, making it impossible for me to fulfill the terms of the will. He's stealing my inheritance right out from under me. He didn't steal anything, Clara shot back, her fear turning to a hot, righteous anger. He showed me kindness when you showed me nothing but contempt. Caleb's charming mask dropped completely. His face became a snarl of pure hatred. Kindness, he hissed, grabbing her arm. His grip was like iron. Let me tell you what my brother's kindness really is. It's control. He's always been like this. Perfect Thomas. Always making me look bad. But not this time. This time I win. His fingers dug into her flesh, and Clara cried out in pain. You're going to leave, Caleb ordered, his face inches from hers. You're going to pack your bag, walk to that train station, and you are going to disappear. And if you ever tell Thomas I was here, I will make you regret it. I will tell this whole town such stories about you. They'll run you out on a rail. Fear, cold and familiar, washed away her anger. She had seen this kind of man before. Her ex-husband had had the same look in his eyes right before he raised his hand to her. Suddenly, the sound of a wagon rattled in the distance. Thomas was coming back. Caleb's head snapped up. He released her arm as if it had burned him. He gave her one last venomous look. Remember what I said, he whispered. Then he turned, vaulted over the porch railing with surprising agility, and disappeared around the side of the barn just as Thomas's wagon pulled into the yard. Thomas saw her standing there, saw the terror on her face, the red marks already forming on her arm. "Clara?" he asked, jumping down from the wagon, his face etched with concern. "What happened? Who was here?" Clara opened her mouth to tell him everything. But Caleb's threat echoed in her ears. They'll run you out on a rail. She had nowhere else to go. This fragile sanctuary was the only thing she had. And this man, Caleb, had the power to burn it to the ground. So she lied. "No one," she whispered, pulling her sleeve down to cover the bruises. I just stumbled. I'm fine." Thomas looked from her face to the spot where Caleb had disappeared, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He knew she was lying. She could see it in his face. And in that moment, the first secret was planted between them, a seed of poison in the only garden she had left. And she knew with a chilling certainty that it was only a matter of time before it grew. The lie sat between them at the dinner table that night, a third, unwelcome guest. Thomas was quieter than usual. He kept glancing at her, his brow furrowed with a question he wasn't asking. Clara kept her eyes on her plate, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every time a floorboard creaked, she jumped, convinced Caleb was outside, watching, waiting. The bruises on her arm throbbed, a physical reminder of her fear and her deceit. Finally, Thomas put his fork down. "Clara," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I know someone was here." She looked up, startled. "The dog," he said. "He only barks like that for one person." Clara's blood ran cold. She didn't have to ask. "It was Caleb, wasn't it?" She couldn't speak. She could only nod, a tiny, miserable movement. Thomas closed his eyes and let out a long, weary breath. It was the sound of a man who had carried the same heavy weight for too many years. "What did he say to you?" he asked. his eyes opening again. They were filled not with anger at her, but with a deep, smoldering rage directed at his brother. Clara hesitated. Caleb's threat was still so vivid in her mind. But the lie felt worse. It felt like a betrayal of the one man who had shown her true decency. So, in a halting, trembling voice, she told him everything. About the will, about the inheritance, about Caleb's plan to use her and discard her, about his threats. She left out only one part: the way he had grabbed her. She didn't want to see what Thomas's quiet rage would look like if it was fully unleashed. When she finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Thomas stared at the scarred wood of the table, his hands clenched into tight fists. "I am so sorry, Clara," he said finally, his voice thick with shame. "I knew he was selfish. I knew he was cruel. But I never thought he would sink this low." He looked up at her, and the pain in his eyes was so profound it stole her breath. "This ranch," he said, his voice low and strained. "It wasn't supposed to be this way. My father, he loved this land. He loved both his sons. He thought the will would force Caleb to become a better man. He thought a wife, a family, would settle him." He shook his head. "But it only gave him something else to break." He stood up and began to pace the small kitchen, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "He won't get away with this," Thomas said, more to himself than to her. "I won't let him drive you away. You are under my protection now. This is your home, for as long as you want it to be. I swear it." His promise was a shield against the fear that had been gripping her all afternoon. But even as she felt a wave of gratitude wash over her, a cold current of reality pulled her under. This wasn't just about her anymore. She had walked into the middle of a war between two brothers. A war over land, over a father's legacy, over years of resentment that had festered into pure hatred. And Caleb Stone was not the kind of man who would accept defeat gracefully. He had threatened her once. He would do it again. And next time he might not be satisfied with just words and bruises. Next time he would come for Thomas. And she, the woman who was supposed to be his salvation, would be the cause of his destruction. That night, sleep would not come. Clara lay in her bed, staring at the moonlight on the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the prairie. Every rustle of the wind sounded like footsteps. Every coyote's cry sounded like a threat. She had come here seeking a safe harbor, a quiet place to heal. Instead, she had sailed directly into the heart of a storm, and she was beginning to realize that the secrets in this valley ran deeper and darker than just a father's will. There was something else here, something Thomas wasn't telling her, a shadow from the past that gave Caleb's hatred its venomous power, and she was trapped in the middle of it. The next morning, an unspoken truce of fragility hung over the house. Thomas left before dawn, his face set like granite. He didn't say where he was going, but Clara knew. He was going to confront his brother. She spent the morning in a state of high anxiety, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't even knead bread. She scrubbed floors that were already clean, tidied shelves that were already organized, anything to keep her mind from picturing the confrontation. Would there be yelling, a fist fight, or something worse? Thomas returned at midday. One look at his face told her it had gone badly. There was a fresh cut on his cheekbone and a dark bruise forming near his eye. His knuckles were raw and bloody. He walked past her without a word, went to the basin and splashed cold water on his face. "Thomas," she whispered, her heart aching at the sight of him. "He won't be bothering you again," he said, his back still to her. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. But Clara knew that was a lie. A man like Caleb didn't just walk away. A fire like that, once lit, doesn't go out. It only grows, seeking more to consume. "He'll come back," she said, stating the simple, terrifying truth. Thomas finally turned to face her, The weariness in his eyes seemed 100 years old. Then I'll be ready for him. But how could he be ready for what was coming next? A few days later, a rider from town brought the mail. Among the letters was a folded newspaper. Thomas thanked the man and brought it inside, his face grim. He unfolded it on the kitchen table, and there, on the front page, was a story. The headline read, "Local Rancher Takes in Woman of Ill Repute." The article, written with dripping insinuation and veiled accusations, told a twisted version of her story. It painted her as a desperate, scheming woman who had been run out of her last town for unseemly behavior. It hinted at debts, at loose morals, at a past shrouded in shame. It didn't mention her by name, but it didn't have to. A woman of a certain age and a certain size, it said, lately arrived on the noon train. Everyone in town would know exactly who it was about. And at the bottom, the article was attributed to a concerned citizen. Clara knew who the citizen was. Caleb. This was his new weapon. Not fists, but words. Poisonous, public words. He couldn't force her out with his hands, so he would use the whole town to do it for him. "Thomas, she began, her voice thick with shame. "I should go. I'm bringing this trouble on you." "No," Thomas said, his voice a low growl. He crumpled the newspaper in his fist. "This isn't your fault. This is his, and we are not going to run." His resolve was like a rock, but Clara felt like sand slipping away. The whispers at the station had been bad enough. This was a public branding, a scarlet letter printed in black ink for the whole world to see. The next time they had to go to town for supplies, the change was palpable. The whispers were no longer hidden behind gloved hands. They were open, hostile. The women who had offered sidelong glances of pity now looked at her with outright scorn. Men who had ignored her now stared with a leering curiosity. In the general store, the clerk served her with a grimace, practically throwing her purchases on the counter. As they were leaving, the sheriff stopped them on the boardwalk. He was a big man with a florid face and small, mean eyes. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and looked Clara up and down. "Thomas," he said, ignoring Clara completely, "you sure you know what you've brought into your house? We run a decent town here." "She's a good woman, Sheriff," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And she's under my protection." The sheriff chuckled, a nasty, wet sound. "Protection? Looks to me like you're the one who needs protecting. A man can get into a lot of trouble tying himself to the wrong kind of woman." He tipped his hat. "Just some friendly advice." As he walked away, Clara felt the eyes of the whole street on them. She was no longer just an outcast. She was a scandal. On the long, silent ride back to the ranch, she felt the last of her fragile hope begin to crumble. Thomas was one man. How could one man stand against the judgment of an entire town? How could his kindness survive being poisoned by so many lies? She looked over at his profile, at the hard line of his jaw, the cut still visible on his cheek. He was a good man, an honorable man, and she was going to be the ruin of him. That night she didn't weep. She was beyond tears. She packed her small carpet bag in the dark, her movements slow and deliberate. She would leave before dawn. She would walk away, disappear back into the lonely world she came from. It was the only way to save him. She would not let her presence destroy the only good man she had ever known. She wrote a short note, her hand shaking. "Thank you for your kindness. I am sorry for the trouble." She left it on the kitchen table. Then, with her bag in her hand, she crept to the front door, her heart a cold, dead weight in her chest. She pulled the door open, and Thomas was standing there on the porch, waiting for her, as if he knew. He wasn't angry. He just looked sad. "Don't, Clara," he said softly. "Don't let him win." And in that moment she realized a terrible truth. Leaving wouldn't save him. It would only prove Caleb right. "I can't stay," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Look at what I'm doing to you. The town, the sheriff, your own brother. I'm a poison, Thomas." "No," he said, his voice firm, unyielding. "You're not the poison. He is. And the only way to fight poison is to stand your ground, not run from it." He stepped aside from the door, a silent invitation for her to go back inside. The choice was still hers. Clara looked past him, out into the vast, dark prairie. It was a lonely, terrifying emptiness. An emptiness she knew all too well. Then she looked back at him, at his tired, bruised face, at the unwavering resolve in his eyes. For 50 years she had been running. Running from the whispers, from the scorn, from the belief that she was worthless. Running had never saved her. It had only led her to another empty station, another lonely room. Maybe he was right. Maybe the only way out was through. With a deep, shuddering breath, she stepped back inside the house and closed the door on the night. She had made her choice. She would stay. She would fight. But she had no idea that the fight was about to become far more dangerous than just whispers and newspaper articles. A week later, it happened. They were in the barn, pitching hay into the loft. It was hard, honest work, and for a few hours Clara had almost forgotten the town, forgotten Caleb. Suddenly the dog started barking, a frantic, furious sound. Thomas put down his pitchfork, his body instantly alert. "Stay here," he ordered, and walked toward the barn door. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She crept to the doorway and peered out. 3 men on horseback were riding into the yard. Caleb was in the lead. Beside him was the sheriff. And the third man was a stranger, with a cruel, pinched face and a dusty bowler hat. "Thomas," Caleb called out, his voice full of false cheer. "We've come to call." Thomas walked out to meet them, his posture calm, but his hands were loosely at his sides, ready. "You're not welcome on my land, Caleb," Thomas said, his voice low and even. "Oh, this isn't a social visit," Caleb said, swinging down from his horse. The sheriff and the other man did the same. "This is business. Allow me to introduce Mr. Abernathy. He's a lawyer." The stranger, Abernathy, stepped forward, holding a piece of paper. "Mr. Stone," the lawyer said in a reedy voice, "I am here to serve you with a notice of contest regarding your father's will. My client, Mr. Caleb Stone, contends that you have exerted undue influence and have failed to act in good faith concerning the conditions of his inheritance." Thomas just stared at Caleb. "You're really going to do this?" "I told you I'd win, brother," Caleb sneered. "The will states that if I marry, the land is to be redivided. It does not say who I have to marry." Clara's stomach plummeted. "Therefore," the lawyer continued, "my client has made a new arrangement. He is to be married next month." "To who?" Thomas asked, though Clara felt like she already knew the answer, and it was impossible. Caleb smiled, a triumphant, vicious smile. He gestured toward the road. Riding toward them in a small, elegant buggy was a woman. She was young, beautiful, dressed in fine clothes, her face a mask of smug satisfaction. "Thomas," Caleb said, his voice dripping with venomous pleasure, "I'd like you to meet my fiancée, the daughter of Judge Abernathy." He was marrying the lawyer's daughter. It was a checkmate, a legal, binding move that would give him exactly what he wanted. "And as part of this contest," the lawyer piped up, "we have filed a motion to have an independent party take control of this property until the matter is settled in court, to ensure no assets are misplaced." The sheriff stepped forward, a smirk on his face. "That independent party would be me. Thomas, I'm going to have to ask you and the woman to vacate the premises by sundown." They were being thrown out, off their own land. Caleb had won. He had used the law, the town, and his own brother's decency against him. Thomas stood there, frozen, as the reality of the situation crashed down on him. He had lost everything: his home, his legacy. Clara watched from the barn, her body numb with shock and despair. This was all her fault. If she had never come here, none of this would have happened. She was his ruin, just as she had feared. As the sheriff began walking toward the house, Caleb turned his attention back to Thomas. "You see, brother," he said, his voice a low, triumphant whisper. "I told you. I always get what's mine. And once I have this land, I'm going to burn that house to the ground, just to erase the memory of you ever being here." Something inside Thomas snapped. With a roar of pure, primal rage, he launched himself at his brother. The fight was brutal and quick. Thomas, fueled by a lifetime of quiet rage, landed 2 hard punches before the sheriff could react. Caleb went down hard in the dust. But then, the sheriff was on Thomas, pulling him back, his big arms pinning Thomas's. "That's assault, Stone," the sheriff bellowed, his face turning purple. Abernathy, the lawyer, scurried backward, his eyes wide with fear. Caleb scrambled to his feet, wiping blood from his lip. His eyes were wild with hatred. He looked at the sheriff. "You see, he's unhinged. He's a danger." "You're under arrest, Thomas," the sheriff grunted, twisting Thomas's arm behind his back. "On what grounds?" Thomas growled, struggling against the man's grip. "Assaulting an officer of the court." "That'd be me," the sheriff said with a grin. "And for the safety of the community, I'm locking you up until the judge can see you." It was a setup, a perfectly executed trap. Clara ran out from the barn. "No, you can't. He was provoking him." Caleb turned his venomous gaze on her. "You stay out of this, you fat cow. This is family business." The insult, raw and public, hit her harder than a slap. The sheriff dragged a struggling Thomas toward his horse. "You have until sundown to get off this property, ma'am," he called over his shoulder to Clara. "Any of your things left here after that become property of the county." They tied Thomas's hands and forced him onto his horse. As they rode away, Thomas looked back at her. His face was a mask of defeat and despair. But in his eyes there was a message, a silent plea. Don't give up. Then they were gone, leaving Clara alone in the yard with the dust and the silence and the crushing weight of utter defeat. She was alone. Truly alone this time. Her protector was in jail. Her home was being taken from her. The entire town was against her. Caleb had won. She sank to her knees in the dirt, the fight gone out of her. The old voices, the ones that had haunted her for 50 years, came screaming back. "You are a curse. Everything you touch, you destroy. You are worthless." For a long time, she just knelt there, letting the despair wash over her. It was easier to drown than to fight. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in colors of fire and blood. Sundown. She had to leave. She stood up on shaky legs and walked into the house. It was so quiet, so empty. His hat was on a peg by the door. His worn coat was slung over a chair. This place had been the first real home she had ever known. And now she was being evicted. She went to her room and picked up her old battered carpet bag. It was over. She had lost. She walked back into the main room, ready to leave, ready to surrender. And then she saw it. On the small mantelpiece above the fireplace, tucked behind an old tin-type photo of Thomas's parents, was a key. A small, ornate iron key. She had noticed it before, but had thought nothing of it. It didn't seem to go to any of the doors in the house. But now, as she looked at it, Thomas's last look came back to her. That desperate plea in his eyes. Her gaze swept the room. It was a simple room. A table, chairs, a fireplace, and a large, heavy-looking wooden chest that sat in the corner. A chest she had always assumed was just for storing blankets. But it had a keyhole. A small, ornate, iron keyhole. Her heart started to beat faster. It was crazy. It was a fool's hope. but it was the only hope she had. With trembling hands, she took the key from the mantel. She walked to the chest. She knelt down. She put the key in the lock. It fit. She turned it. There was a loud, satisfying click. She lifted the heavy lid. It wasn't full of blankets. It was full of papers. Old, yellowed deeds, account ledgers. And on the very top was a letter, bound in ribbon. It was addressed not to Thomas or to Caleb. It was addressed to her, to Clara. Her hands shook so badly she could barely untie the ribbon. She unfolded the letter. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, the writing of an old man. It began, "My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, it means my son Thomas has found you, and that my other son, Caleb, has tried to ruin you. For that I am truly, deeply sorry." It was from their father, Old Man Stone. He had written it just before he died. Clara's mind struggled to make sense of it. How could he have known? How could he have written a letter to her? She kept reading, her eyes flying across the page. "I have known for many years about the darkness in my son Caleb's heart. I have watched it grow, and it has been the great sorrow of my life. I also know my son Thomas's heart. It is good and true, but it is also burdened by a guilt he should not have to carry." Guilt? What guilt? When Thomas's first wife, Eleanor, died, the doctor said it was a fever. That was a lie I paid him to tell. The truth is, Eleanor took her own life. She could no longer bear Caleb's relentless attentions. He was obsessed with her. He hounded her, tormented her, until she saw no other way out. A gasp escaped Clara's lips. This wasn't just a story of greed. It was a story of obsession and death. Thomas has always blamed himself. He thinks if he had been a better husband, a better protector, she would still be alive. He carries that weight every single day. Caleb, meanwhile, feels no remorse. He only feels rage that the thing he wanted was taken from him. The letter continued, outlining a plan the old man had set in motion from beyond the grave. "I knew Caleb would try to use my will to steal the ranch. So I added another provision, a secret one, known only to my lawyer in the city, not the charlatan Abernathy, but my true family lawyer. The provision states that if Caleb contests the will or acts with malice toward his brother, his entire inheritance is forfeit. But how to prove it? The old man's plan was audacious. It was a trap. I needed a witness, someone of unimpeachable character, someone who had no stake in the family fortune, someone who Caleb himself would choose and then mistreat. I began to make inquiries through trusted friends in other towns. I searched for a woman who was known for her kindness, her dignity, and her resilience in the face of cruelty. A woman who, if she said something was true, would be believed. My search led me to you, Clara." Clara had to sit down on the floor, the letter shaking in her hands. This wasn't an accident. None of it. Her arrival. Thomas being at the station. It was all a plan. I instructed Thomas to watch for your letter of acceptance to Caleb. I told him to go to the station and, if Caleb failed to show, to bring you home and keep you safe. I told him that you were the key to saving the ranch, and perhaps to saving him from his own sorrow. You, Clara, with your good and honest heart, would be the witness to Caleb's cruelty. Your testimony would be the proof needed to enact the final clause of my will. She wasn't a burden. She wasn't a curse. She was the key. She was their only hope. At the bottom of the chest, beneath the deeds and ledgers, was another envelope. Inside was a deed to a small but valuable parcel of land right in the middle of Thomas's ranch. The parcel with the main well, the only reliable source of water for miles. And the deed was in her name. Clara. The old man had bought it through a third party and signed it over to her before he died. He had left her a note with it. A woman of your character deserves a home of her own. This is yours, no matter what happens. No man can ever take it from you. For the first time in 50 years, she owned something. She had roots. She had power. The despair that had crushed her just moments before was replaced by a fierce, burning resolve. Caleb thought he had won. The sheriff thought he had the law on his side. The whole town thought she was a worthless woman of ill repute. They were all wrong. They had underestimated her. They had mistaken her gentleness for weakness. But a tree that has weathered a lifetime of storms has the strongest roots of all. She gathered the letter and the deed. She put them in her carpet bag. She walked out of the house just as the last rays of sun disappeared behind the hills. She did not look back. She started walking toward town. She had a prisoner to set free and a war to win. The walk to town was long and dark. The prairie night was filled with unfamiliar sounds, but for the first time Clara was not afraid. The fear that had been her constant companion for 50 years had been burned away by the fire of her new purpose. She arrived in town just after midnight. The streets were dark and empty. The only light came from the saloon and the sheriff's office. She went to the sheriff's office first. Through the window she could see him sleeping in his chair, his feet propped up on his desk, an empty bottle beside him. Thomas was in the cell at the back, sitting on the edge of a cot, his head in his hands. She knocked on the door, loudly. The sheriff jolted awake, knocking the bottle to the floor. He grumbled and cursed as he stomped to the door and pulled it open. "What in the—" he began, then his eyes focused on her. "You. I told you to be off that land by sundown." "I am off the land," Clara said, her voice steady and clear. "I am here to see Mr. Stone." "No visitors for prisoners," the sheriff grunted, trying to close the door. Clara put her foot in the doorway. "I am not here to visit a prisoner," she said, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "I am here to post bail for an innocent man who has been wrongfully arrested." The sheriff stared at her, then burst out laughing. "Bail? With what? You ain't got 2 cents to rub together." Clara reached into her bag and pulled out the deed. She unfolded it and held it up in front of his face. "I believe this parcel of land, including the only deep-water well in the valley, is worth more than enough to cover any bail you could possibly invent, Sheriff." The sheriff's laughter died in his throat. He snatched the deed from her hand and stared at it, his eyes wide with disbelief. He knew the land. He knew what that well was worth. It was worth more than both ranches combined. This can't be real," he stammered. "It is very real," Clara said. "It was filed with the county clerk 3 months ago. Now, are you going to release Mr. Stone, or will my first act as a prominent local landowner be to hire a federal marshal to investigate the rampant corruption in this town, starting with its sheriff?" The sheriff swallowed hard. The color drained from his face. He looked from the deed to Clara's unblinking eyes, and he saw his comfortable, corrupt little world crumbling around him. Without another word, he turned, fumbled for his keys, and unlocked Thomas's cell. Thomas looked up, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief, as he saw Clara standing there, facing down the sheriff. "Clara, what's going on?" "We're leaving, Thomas," she said, her voice softening. "It's time to go home." They walked out of the sheriff's office and into the cool night air, leaving the sheriff standing in the doorway, the deed still clutched in his trembling hand. "How did you—" Thomas began, but Clara just shook her head. "I'll explain on the way. But first, we have one more stop to make." She led him not to the ranch, but to the town's small hotel. "We need to send a telegram," she said, "to your father's lawyer, the real one." The night clerk at the hotel stared at them, but Clara's newfound confidence was a shield he couldn't penetrate. She wrote out the telegram, her words, precise and clear, explaining the situation and quoting key phrases from the old man's letter. She instructed the lawyer to come at once and to bring all the necessary documents to enforce the final clause of the will. As the clerk tapped out the message, Thomas finally read his father's letter. He read it once, then twice, his hands shaking. He learned the truth about his wife's death, the truth about his brother's evil, and the truth about his own misplaced guilt. A lifetime of sorrow, a burden he had carried for a decade, began to lift from his shoulders. When he looked up at Clara, his eyes were shining with tears. "He sent you," he whispered. "My father. He sent me an angel." "He sent a witness," Clara corrected gently. "And now it's time for that witness to testify." They didn't go back to the ranch that night. They knew Caleb and the sheriff would be expecting them there. Instead, they went to the one place no one would ever think to look for them, the church. The old preacher, a kind man who had always looked at Clara with compassion rather than judgment, let them in without question. He gave them blankets and let them sleep in the back pews. As they settled down in the quiet, holy darkness, Thomas reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and firm. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "everything I have, everything I am, it's because of you. You saved me." "No, Thomas," she whispered back, lacing her fingers through his. "We saved each other." And there, in the quiet church, two souls who had been lost in the wilderness for a lifetime finally found their sanctuary. But they both knew the battle was not over. The lawyer was coming. The truth was coming. And so was Caleb. And the final confrontation would not be fought with deeds and telegrams. It would be fought with fire and with blood. The next 2 days were the quiet before the storm. Clara and Thomas stayed hidden in the church, cared for by the kindly preacher. The town buzzed with rumors. The sheriff, terrified of Clara's threat, had told everyone that Thomas had been released on his own recognizance. He made no move against them. He was waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Caleb, however, was not the waiting type. He rode through town like a conquering hero, telling anyone who would listen that the ranch was his, that his reprobate brother and the harlot he'd taken in had fled in the night. He didn't know about the telegram. He didn't know about the letter. He thought he had already won. On the 3rd day, the lawyer from the city arrived on the noon train. Mr. Fitzgerald was the opposite of Abernathy. He was an older man with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He met Clara and Thomas at the church, read the father's letter, examined Clara's deed, and nodded grimly. "This is ironclad," he said. "The old man was clever, very clever. With your testimony, Clara, we can strip Caleb of everything." He arranged for a hearing at the town hall for the following morning. He sent a summons to Caleb, to Abernathy, and to the sheriff. The entire town would be there. The stage was set for the final act. That night, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, Thomas found Clara standing by the church window, looking out toward the ranch. "Are you afraid?" he asked softly. "I've been afraid my whole life," she answered, not turning around. "Afraid of what people would say, afraid of being alone, afraid I wasn't worth loving." She finally turned to face him, a small, sad smile on her lips. "I'm not afraid any more. Whatever happens tomorrow, they can't take away the truth. And they can't take away this." She gestured between the two of them. Thomas stepped closer. He reached out and gently touched the scar on her cheek, the one from her ex-husband. "No one will ever hurt you again, Clara," he said, his voice a solemn vow. "I promise you that." In that moment, under the soft light of the stained glass windows, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss. It was gentle. It was tender. It was a promise of a future, a home, a life where she would be cherished, not just accepted. It was the first kiss of her life that had ever felt like coming home, but their peaceful moment was shattered by a sudden, frantic ringing of the church bell. The preacher burst into the room, his face pale with terror. "The ranch!" he cried. "It's on fire! Clara and Thomas ran outside. On the horizon, against the dark purple sky, a terrible orange glow lit up the clouds. The ranch house, their home, it was burning. Caleb. He couldn't have the ranch, so he was destroying it, just like he'd promised. "He's gone mad," Thomas whispered, his face a mask of horror. But Clara knew it was worse than that. This wasn't just about the ranch. It was a trap. He was trying to lure them out there, away from the safety of the town, away from the protection of the lawyer. "We can't go," she said, grabbing Thomas's arm. "It's what he wants." But Thomas was already running toward the livery stable. The rage in his eyes was terrifying. This was the final betrayal, the desecration of his home, his father's legacy. "That's my home," he yelled back at her. "I will not let him burn it to the ground." Clara knew she couldn't stop him, so she ran after him. They saddled their horses in a frantic hurry. As they were about to ride out, Mr. Fitzgerald ran up to them. "Don't go, it's a trick," he pleaded. "Stay here," Thomas ordered him. "No matter what happens, you make sure that hearing happens tomorrow. You tell them the truth. You tell them everything." And with that, they spurred their horses and rode out of town, racing toward the pillar of smoke and fire that was once their home. They rode hard, the glow of the fire growing brighter and brighter, a terrible beacon in the night. As they crested the final hill overlooking the valley, they saw it. The house was an inferno, flames leaping high into the night sky. And standing in the yard, silhouetted against the blaze, was Caleb. He was not alone. With him were the sheriff and 3 other men, all of them holding rifles. It was an ambush. "Thomas!" Caleb's voice, distorted by the roar of the fire, echoed across the valley. "I knew you'd come. I knew you couldn't resist playing the hero." Thomas pulled his horse to a halt. He reached for the rifle in his saddle scabbard. "Don't, Thomas," Clara pleaded. "There are too many of them." "I'm not letting him get away," Thomas growled, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "Welcome to the party, brother," Caleb shouted, raising his own rifle. "I've decided to amend my legal strategy. No witnesses, no problem." The sheriff raised his rifle. The other men did the same. They were trapped, outnumbered. The fire roared, the heat washing over them. Their home was turning to ash before their very eyes. And in the middle of the yard, Caleb laughed, his face a demonic mask of triumph and madness. He had finally cornered them, and he was going to burn them, just like he had burned everything else they loved. "It's over, Thomas," Caleb screamed over the crackle of the flames. "Give up. You have nothing left." Thomas raised his rifle, his knuckles white. "I'll always have more than you, Caleb, because I have a soul." The sheriff leveled his gun at Thomas. "Drop it, Stone. It's 5 against 2. But he was wrong. It wasn't 2. From the darkness behind them, a voice rang out. "Drop your weapons. Now!" Caleb and the sheriff spun around. Standing at the edge of the valley, rifles in their hands, were a dozen men. Farmers, ranchers, the quiet men from the neighboring homesteads. The very men who had looked at Clara with suspicion in town. At the front was the old preacher, holding a shotgun with surprising confidence. Beside him was Mr. Fitzgerald, looking terrified but resolute. He had ridden for help the moment they left. He had gone to the people of the valley, the ones who knew Thomas not as a scandal, but as a good neighbor, a man who helped mend fences, who shared his water in a drought, who sat with them when their children were sick. He had told them the truth, and they had come. The sheriff's jaw dropped. He looked at the dozen rifles pointed at him and his men, and the fight went out of his eyes. He slowly lowered his gun. His 3 hired thugs did the same. But Caleb was beyond reason. His eyes were wild, fixed on Thomas. "No, this is my land, mine." He raised his rifle and fired, but he wasn't aiming at Thomas. He was aiming at Clara. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The flash of the gun, the crack echoing in the night. Clara felt a searing white-hot pain in her shoulder. The force of it knocked her from her horse. She hit the ground hard, the world spinning into a painful, gray blur. The last thing she heard before she blacked out was Thomas screaming her name, followed by the deafening roar of a dozen rifles firing at once. Clara woke up to the smell of coffee and clean linens. Sunlight was streaming through a window, and for a confused moment she thought she was back in her room at the ranch. But the room was different, and her shoulder was tightly bandaged, throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. She tried to sit up, and a gentle hand pushed her back down. Thomas. He was sitting in a chair beside her bed. His face was etched with exhaustion and worry, but his eyes were clear. "Easy now," he said softly. "You took a bullet. The doc says it went clean through. You're going to be fine." "What? What happened?" she whispered, her throat dry. "It's over," he said. "It's all over." He told her everything. After Caleb shot her, the ranchers had opened fire. Caleb was gone. The sheriff and his men had surrendered immediately. The hearing had happened the next morning. Mr. Fitzgerald, armed with the father's letter and the testimony of the preacher, had laid out the entire conspiracy. The town was in shock. They had been so quick to judge, so eager to believe the lies. Faced with the truth of Caleb's evil and Thomas's quiet honor, they were filled with a deep, collective shame. The sheriff was arrested by a U.S. Marshal. Abernathy was disbarred. The will was executed as the father had intended. The entire Stone estate, both ranches, everything. It all belonged to Thomas now. And her deed to the well was rock solid. She was a landowner, a woman of property and standing. "The house is gone," Thomas said, his voice heavy with sadness. "Burned to the foundation." Clara reached out and took his hand. "We'll build a new one," she whispered. He squeezed her hand, his eyes filling with tears. "I almost lost you, Clara. When I saw you fall." His voice broke. "But you didn't," she said. "We're still here." A few days later, when she was strong enough to walk, Thomas took her back to the ranch. It was a heartbreaking sight, a black smoking scar where their home had been. But as they stood there, a wagon rolled into the yard, then another, and another. It was the ranchers, the men who had saved them, and their wives. The women who had whispered and stared at her in town now approached her with shy, apologetic faces. One of them, the storekeeper's wife, held out a freshly baked loaf of bread. We're so sorry, Mrs. Ma'am," she stammered. "We were wrong about you. Can you forgive us?" Clara looked at their faces, at the genuine remorse in their eyes. She thought of her lifetime of bitterness, the heavy stone of resentment she had carried for so long, and she let it go. "There's nothing to forgive," she said, and her smile was as bright and clear as the prairie sun. The men set to work immediately, clearing the rubble, felling new trees, laying the foundations for a new house. The women set up tables, bringing food and drink. It was a barn raising, but for a home. A community once broken by lies, now coming together to heal and rebuild. Standing there, watching her neighbors work, Thomas put his arm around her shoulders, careful of her wound. "Looks like you have a home, after all," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Clara leaned her head against his good shoulder. "No," she said softly. "We have a home." In the end, her story was never about the words they threw at her or the cruel laughter that chased her down dusty streets. It was about the quiet courage of holding on, of choosing dignity when the world tried to strip it away, and about discovering that love doesn't ask you to be perfect. It just asks you to be true. When Thomas had reached for her, not with pity but with certainty, she finally understood something that many people spend a lifetime searching for. That being enough was never the question. She had always been enough. What changed was finally finding someone brave enough to see it. And maybe that's a lesson for all of us. No matter how many seasons we've weathered, no matter what labels the world has tried to press upon us, there is always a place for tenderness, for kindness, and for a love that sees us for who we truly are. Sometimes it arrives late, sometimes it arrives in the most unexpected way, but it is never, ever too late to be chosen, never too late to be seen, and never too late to find your way home. If this story touched your heart, I hope you'll subscribe for more tales of the untamed West. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that their worth is not determined by the opinions of others. And please leave a comment below. Your voice truly matters in our community. Tell me, what part of Clara's journey resonated with you the most?